In the sweltering heat of a Tehran summer, diplomacy has given way to the rhetoric of war. On July 8, 2025, Iran issued a chilling warning: any existential threat would be met with an unpredictable, devastating response. The world now stands at a precipice, as the fragile ceasefire masks a region on the edge of unprecedented conflict. With nuclear proliferation and global energy at stake, leaders everywhere must now confront a terrifying question: how do you negotiate with a nation that feels it has nothing left to lose? In June 2025, the world watched in shock as a long-simmering conflict exploded into open warfare. Israel, citing what it described as an imminent nuclear threat from Iran, launched a sudden and massive bombing campaign deep inside Iranian territory. The operation was meticulously planned, involving dozens of fighter jets, precision-guided munitions, and real-time intelligence. Within hours, key Iranian military and nuclear sites were targeted, sending a clear message that Israel would not tolerate the risk of a nuclear-armed adversary in the region. The skies over the Middle East lit up with explosions, and the world braced for what would come next. Iran's response was swift and fierce. Within minutes, Iranian forces unleashed a barrage of missiles and waves of armed drones, targeting Israeli cities, military bases, and critical infrastructure. Israel's Iron Dome and other air defense systems sprang into action, intercepting many of the incoming threats, but not all. Air raid sirens wailed across Israeli towns, forcing civilians to scramble for shelter in underground bunkers and safe rooms. The psychological toll was immediate, as families huddled together, listening to the distant thud of explosions and the crackle of anti-aircraft fire. The conflict quickly escalated beyond a simple exchange of firepower. The war soon spilled beyond the skies and cities. Naval clashes erupted in the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, as both sides sought to disrupt each other's supply lines and assert control over vital shipping routes. Oil tankers became targets, and the threat to global energy supplies sent shockwaves through international markets. Stock exchanges from New York to Tokyo plunged into turmoil, as investors feared a prolonged conflict could choke off the world's oil lifeline. The economic consequences rippled far beyond the battlefield, affecting millions who had no stake in the fight. For 12 relentless days, both nations endured and inflicted heavy damage. Cities on both sides bore the scars of missile strikes and air raids. Hospitals overflowed with casualties, and emergency responders worked around the clock amid the chaos. Military convoys moved through shattered streets, while families searched for loved ones in the rubble. Yet, despite the intensity of the fighting and the devastation wrought, neither Israel nor Iran managed to secure a decisive victory. The war became a brutal stalemate, with each side suffering losses but refusing to back down. The conflict marked a dramatic shift from years of covert operations and proxy battles to direct, open confrontation. Political leaders on both sides delivered defiant speeches, vowing to defend their nations at any cost. Soldiers remained on high alert, and the streets of Tehran and Tel Aviv filled with anxious citizens, some protesting, others simply trying to survive. The war left both countries bloodied, their populations traumatized, and the entire region more volatile than ever before. The world watched, uncertain if this was the end or just the beginning of something even more dangerous. When a ceasefire was finally brokered at the United Nations, it brought a fragile halt to the violence. But for those living through the devastation, the ceasefire felt less like true peace and more like a tense, uneasy pause, a brief respite before the next storm. The scars of the 12-day war would linger, shaping the future of the Middle East and the world's uneasy search for stability. As the war raged on, the world watched with bated breath. Cities across Iran were plunged into chaos as air raid sirens wailed and the night sky lit up with the flashes of distant explosions. The international community scrambled to respond, but events were moving too quickly for diplomacy to catch up. In the early hours before dawn, the United States launched Operation Midnight Hammer, a meticulously planned, high-stakes aerial assault. Waves of stealth bombers and fighter jets roared into Iranian airspace, their mission clear: to neutralize Iran's nuclear infrastructure before it could be used as leverage or, worse, weaponized. The world's most advanced aircraft, including B-2 bombers and F-22 Raptors, executed precision strikes, targeting facilities that had long been at the center of international concern. The bombers struck with devastating accuracy. Natanz, Fordow, and Isfahan, named synonymous with Iran's nuclear ambitions, were rocked by bunker-busting munitions designed to penetrate deep underground. Massive explosions sent shockwaves through the region, as plumes of smoke and fire rose from the targeted sites. Satellite images soon revealed the extent of the destruction, with entire sections of the facilities reduced to rubble. In a televised address from the Oval Office, President Trump declared the operation a resounding success. He assured the American public and the world that Iran's nuclear program had been set back by years, if not decades. The administration framed the strikes as a necessary act of self-defense, a message echoed in press briefings and news coverage across the globe. In Tehran, the mood was one of outrage and defiance. Iranian leaders convened an emergency press conference condemning the attack as a blatant act of aggression and a violation of international law. Crowds poured into the streets, waving flags and chanting anti-American slogans, while the Iranian parliament issued a fiery statement vowing to rebuild the nuclear program stronger than ever before. The airstrikes shattered the last fragile remnants of the 2015 nuclear deal, which had already been hanging by a thread. News outlets around the world flashed headlines announcing the collapse of years of painstaking diplomacy. The United Nations Security Council called an emergency session as diplomats scrambled to contain the fallout and prevent the conflict from spiraling further out of control. For Iran, the strikes were a profound betrayal, a signal that negotiation was no longer an option. For Washington, it was a demonstration of resolve, a warning to adversaries everywhere. Both sides now found themselves locked in a far more dangerous standoff, with military forces on high alert and diplomatic channels all but frozen. As missiles continued to launch and the world map lit up with new conflict zones, civilians across Iran sought shelter, fearing what might come next. The risk of catastrophic war had never been higher, and the world braced itself for the next move in a crisis that now threatened to engulf the entire region and beyond. Under immense pressure to respond, Iran launched a carefully calibrated missile strike at the U.S. Al-Udeid airbase in Qatar. The attack was designed to send a message, not to cause mass casualties. Most missiles were intercepted and damage was minimal. Tehran claimed victory, demonstrating its reach while avoiding a wider war. Supreme Leader Khamenei called it a heavy slap, projecting strength to Iran's allies and public. Yet the strike crossed a dangerous line, highlighting the region's volatility and the risk of miscalculation. Even limited retaliation now carried the threat of uncontrollable escalation. The cycle of provocation and response seemed impossible to break. In protest of the strikes, Iran suspended all cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency, ending crucial nuclear monitoring. Yet, Tehran stopped short of leaving the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, signaling a desire to keep diplomatic options open. Iran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium remains a flashpoint, enough for several bombs, just weeks from weaponization. The West demands its removal. Iran insists its program is peaceful. The strikes intended to halt proliferation have instead driven Iran's program deeper into the shadows. With transparency gone, suspicion and fear now dominate, pushing the crisis to the brink. The world watches as Iran walks a perilous line between deterrence and disaster. Amid the chaos, a war of narratives rages. Iran claims Israel's attack was a diversion from its faltering Gaza campaign, a ploy to shift global attention and rally domestic support. Tehran frames itself as a victim of political manipulation, not just military aggression. Meanwhile, Israel and the U.S. insist their actions were a necessary response to Iran's nuclear threat. With no shared understanding of the conflict's origins, finding common ground for peace becomes nearly impossible. Competing stories fuel mistrust, making de-escalation ever more elusive. The truth for now is lost in the fog of war. The region now faces a stark and pivotal choice: diplomacy or renewed war. After years of simmering tensions, the stakes have never been higher. The world watches as leaders weigh their options, knowing that the consequences of their decisions will ripple far beyond their borders. The air is thick with uncertainty, and every move is scrutinized by both allies and adversaries alike. Some see hope in the Qatar-brokered ceasefire, imagining a path to talks and a possible non-aggression pact. For the first time in months, there is a glimmer of optimism that dialogue might prevail over violence. The negotiations in Doha have brought together rival factions, each with their own demands and fears, but united by a fragile desire to avoid further bloodshed. The world's eyes are on these talks, hoping that compromise and understanding can overcome years of mistrust. Such a deal would demand huge concessions, limits on Iran's nuclear program, security guarantees, and sanctions relief. These are not easy asks. For Iran, agreeing to curb its nuclear ambitions means trusting that the West will honor its promises. For the international community, it means accepting a new balance of power in the region. The stakes are enormous and the risks of failure are even greater. But powerful voices on all sides feel the conflict is unfinished, pushing for preemptive action before the next round. Hardliners argue that only strength will bring security, and that any pause in hostilities is merely a chance for adversaries to regroup. In the streets, protesters demand justice and retribution, while military leaders draw up contingency plans, preparing for the possibility that diplomacy will fail. The suspension of IEA inspections only deepens suspicion and accelerates the march toward confrontation. Without transparency, rumors and fears fill the void, making it harder for negotiators to build trust. Each side accuses the other of deception, and the international community grows increasingly anxious as oversight slips away. The next conflict could be far more devastating, drawing in neighbors and shattering the global economy. The scars of previous wars are still visible in ruined cities and displaced families. If diplomacy fails, the consequences could be catastrophic, not just for the region but for the entire world. Energy markets could collapse, refugee crises could intensify, and the fragile hope for peace could be lost for a generation. The choice between war and peace hangs by a thread. Every gesture, every word, every decision made in these tense days could tip the balance. Civil society groups and ordinary citizens plead for restraint, while leaders face immense pressure from all sides. The world holds its breath, hoping that reason will prevail over rage. The world waits for leaders to choose wisdom over vengeance. In this moment, the future is unwritten. The decisions made now will shape not only the fate of the region, but the course of history itself. The hope for peace endures, fragile but unbroken, as the world watches and waits. The crisis has sent shockwaves worldwide. U.S. allies in Europe and Asia urge restraint, fearing regional collapse and a refugee crisis. China, reliant on Gulf oil, condemns the strikes and fears a closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Russia urges Iran to resume IEA cooperation, seeking influence as mediator. Gulf states, vulnerable and within missile range, plead for diplomacy out of self-preservation. The specter of nuclear escalation haunts all. If Iran crosses the threshold, a regional arms race could follow. The nightmare is a war meant to stop proliferation instead causing it. The world's future may hinge on decisions made in the coming weeks. The July 2025 crisis is a stark reminder of how quickly regional tensions can threaten global security. A full-scale war would devastate economies, disrupt oil supplies, and risk nuclear proliferation on an unprecedented scale. Only diplomacy offers hope, requiring all sides to step back, compromise, and recognize each other's security concerns. For the U.S. and Israel, pressure alone has failed. For Iran, nuclear ambitions invite disaster. The path to peace is narrow, but the cost of failure is unimaginable. The world must act now, before the next misstep plunges us all into chaos. The lessons of this crisis must not be ignored.